Good evening, everybody. Who am I? I've got my name now. I'm Chris Lambert from the Electrical Engineering Group, and tonight we put this session on to focus on the process of getting chartered, and very much focused on electrical engineers. So we've got electrical engineers who are chartership assessors forming a panel this evening. So why I've got a captive audience, so I'll touch on a few upcoming events. 14th of April, we've got our student event, which follows on from the one we did last year. We've got 3 young professionals within the first 3 years of their career, which are going to give an update on what a typical day looks like for them. 28th of April, we've got distributed energy resources, connection challenges and opportunities. That's presented by Wealth and Electricity. 19th of May, we've got generator fuel storage. That's presented by Hamish from Fuel Chief. 28th of June, access control. That's presented by Carl from Gallagher. Now, Carl did us a presentation 2 or 3 months ago, and the feedback from the members was they wouldn't mind a session which focused on lock technologies, which he's doing this time. He's going to do one on credentials, access cards, biometrics, and a subsequent one. 14th of July, we've got Schneider returning to do discrimination and cascading. So a quick plug on what we've got coming up. So tonight's event. So this is the first time we've done this. There's been quite a bit of interest as we're a newly formed group of electrical engineers, or newly formed electrical engineering group. So tonight's event, first section is a set of questions to the panel, a Q&A style format. Put in 45 minutes for this. No idea whether that's too short, too long, but this is the first event, so we can always polish it for next year's. The hope is that we'll make this an annual event. Then we'll have some general questions from the members. If you type your questions in, I'll run through them to the panel, and we'll see what answers we get. So the panel. So just mention that it is an electrical focused event. If there's anybody who's not electrical who's dialed in tonight, then a lot of the questions will be valid to them. And as we always say, if you're not an electrical engineer, it's never too late to retrain. So tonight, got some of the greatest minds of the industry on our panel. We've got Greg Blackler, who spends his time between Wanaka and Wellington, who's a building services engineer. We've got Catherine Ward, who's based in Christchurch, who's a power systems engineer. We've got Rob Moore, who's based in Auckland, building services electrical engineer. And we've got Fiona Lynn, who's also based in Auckland. She's a power systems engineer and a lead assessor. Now, if you look at that list, you will see there's a mixture of building services and power engineers. You're probably thinking, well, why is there not anybody who's electronics? That's purely a reflection of our current committee. So if anybody out there is involved in electronics, digital analog, controls, then please join us and bring some different viewpoints to these things. So the questions we're going to ask of the panel tonight are the following 5 questions. How many years of experience do you think it generally takes to have enough experience to consider getting chartered? So in many ways that's saying, well, if you're at the start of your career, how long does it take before you should consider getting chartered? That might be one way of viewing that question. Second question, how long does it typically take for a candidate to prepare their submission on the basis that they have been recording their work experience and training records? I guess that's saying, does it just take you an afternoon or a weekend, or is it a couple of weeks to pull it all together? Question 3, how long does it typically take from submission of a candidate's application to award or decline of CPENs? So once you've submitted it, do you see it back in 2 days? Is it a week? Is it a month? That sort of question seems to come up a lot. Question 4, what are some of the reasons why you've declined a chartership submission? So if you've been unsuccessful, then we can find out some of the reasons what we typically see. And there's probably some good lessons learned in that. Question 5, what is your advice or top 2 or 3 tips for somebody considering getting chartered? So that just really puts to the forum to let us know what they think. Now, we'll go through the questions, but I'll raise a question to the panel in a certain order so everybody gets a chance to go first. Otherwise, if you always go last, you're probably just going to be saying, I generally agree with the previous person. So, my secret running order. So question 1 to the panel. How many years of experience do you think it generally takes to have enough experience to consider getting chartered? And I'll ask that to Rob Moore first.
My indication would be probably about 5 years after graduation, minimum.
Oops, hang on a second, Rob. It's just a bit quiet there. Speak again, please.
My indication would probably be around about 5 years after graduation. The reason for that is that, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you fine. Thanks, Rob.
Yep. So the reason for that is with Chartership, there's a lot of complex engineering, and I don't think that you get into the complex engineering within 5 years.
Thanks, Rob. Catherine, do you have any differing view?
Well, I hate to say I agree with what Rob has said, but to add to that too, there's also understanding code of ethics. And
You'll just pull your microphone towards your face a bit more, Catherine. It seems a little bit subdued.
I would agree with the 5 years
That's good.
for similar reasons to Rob. And adding on to that, it's considerations like code of ethics, how engineers, what they do in difficult situations, dealing with some of their clients who don't want to follow exactly what are the standards and that sort of thing. So 5 years is definitely my opinion as well.
Greg, any differing views?
I think it really depends on what you came into your chartership with. If you've come from a graduate scheme, then you're right, you're starting with a blank piece of paper and you're starting at the very bottom doing the calculations, and you're not experiencing the complex challenges that turn up at your meetings with hundreds of different people having hundreds of different input into your very complex scenario. But if you've come in with the old NZCE technique with lots of engineering or practical background, I think you immediately jump ahead. So my gut feeling, it'll depend. I think 5 years for graduates is a fairly sensible number. 3 to 4 if somebody's come in through the industry, say, instead of through the education process. But it literally is horses for courses until you can get into the very much deeper end of responsibility.
Thanks, Greg. And finally, Fiona. I think you're on mute, Fiona.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now. Thank you.
Yeah. So I agree that
Okay.
that you maybe need at least 5 years. Some do it earlier, some do it much later, depending on the projects that they get involved in. If you are involved in very, very complex projects at the start, which I don't think you would be, then you could put them in earlier, because you need at least 4 projects within the last 6 years to be able to submit, put in a submission. So if you have complex projects up to, when you're in 5 years or more, then you can start to put in the projects. And I guess it takes about 2 to 3 months from your submission for it to first go through the assessment team, and then it goes to the assessment panel, and then to the board, and then you'll get the results then. Okay, thank you.
Cool. Okay. Let's consider that an easy one to start with. Question 2. How long does it typically take a candidate to prepare their submission on the basis that they've been recording their work experience and training records? And I'll ask that one to Catherine to start with.
Well, some candidates have indicated to me it's taken 6 months, and one other gentleman indicated it took a couple of weekends, but he was determined to do it effectively and efficiently. So it's quite varying. It does depend on the how to say, especially like your kept work experience and training records, but also how you structure your write-up. Some people can write an awful lot and refer to a lot of different samples, and some can use a few samples and have a lot of the different competency requirements and address those and say, as per my write-up for this covers this, and this. So quite a bit is how much you structure it. So I said I've heard of a range of a number of quite wide ranging how long it takes to write up. And it does help if you've got someone to guide you in the process, like you might have some colleagues where you work who have got the SC pension, just give you some guidance of what level of detail is required in the write-up. And that would help a lot.
Thanks, Catherine. Greg, any thoughts?
All I know is it's significantly less than when I did it and handed in like 2 ring binders worth of actual paper. It's never been easier. It's never been shorter than it was. And every time we do a system review, it seems to get leaner, meaner, and faster. But I think Catherine's right. If you're methodical about it and extract and reference, it probably is only a couple of weekends solid work.
Thanks, Greg. Fiona, thoughts?
if you have got all your materials prepared, I mean, you've got all your projects there, the 4 projects, and you've got all your CPD, if you really work at it really hard, I've done that in about a month to get everything ready and submit it together with referees and so forth. So you can do it that fast if you have been diligent in the 4 years that, before that, when you have compiled all the information on complexity, all the correspondence and files required for the evidence to meet the various elements. You can do it in a month. That is, you give up all your weekends, that's what I mean, and really slog at it. But others have done it for about 12 months, even for 12 months, collecting information gradually. So it's up to that person. If you have started early, then you can do it quite fast, I think, for the 4 projects. So if you remember 4 projects you need to collect information on. Hope it helps.
Oh, thanks, Fiona. And Rob, any thoughts for yourself?
Yeah, I tend to agree with Greg a bit there. It's a lot easier these days than it was way back when I did mine. You had 12 competencies to get through, and I think they've cut that down to quite a lot less now. I've done a little course with some guys here in the Auckland office, where we spent about an hour and a half every 2 weeks for 6 months, putting all the documentation together and everything. And at the end of that 6 months, they submitted. And but if you took all that time, probably a month, depending how passionate you are, wanting to get your application in, could be a lot less.
Cool, thanks, Rob. Let me just find. Question 3. How long does it typically take from the submission of a candidate's application to award or decline of CPEng? Well, that's that one to you to start with, Greg. Could you just move a bit more towards your microphone, Greg? Might be my hearing, which is short.
The view doesn't get any better. I guess I've never really got involved in the actual hard processing of it, because being a technical assessor, I'd just be the full-on engineering nerd, get in, nerd out the electrical engineering details and leave the admin to somebody else. So I'm probably not the best person to ask that one.
Yeah, but yeah, that's interesting, because I might have assumed that assessor would. That's not meant to sound arrogant in any way, but yeah, good question. Fiona, do you have any thoughts?
I would say that it needs to go first. When you submit it, it goes to the validation team, and they will take a few 1 to 2 weeks to go through it and make sure everything is there, referees, that the evidence is there and so forth. Then it goes to the assessment panel, and you have to wait for the panel to be appointed and the assessors to agree to do your assessment. So that might take another 1 week plus. And then after that, the assessment itself. So it would take maybe at least, depending on the assessor, whether they are fast onto it or there are some delays, then maybe about 2 weeks to a month to conduct the assessment. And then the recommendation needs to go to the board. And we wait for the board meeting that's either on the 1st or 2nd Wednesday of the month. And from that board decision, then it takes maybe a week more for the assessment team to get the details and to send it out to the candidate. So in all, maybe it takes 2 to 3 months before you'll get the answer from the point you submit. Usually we hope to do it within 80, I think they have put down a target of 85 days. Something like that. So that's about 3 months. Hopefully you'll get the answer back, but it depends very much on the panel. If the panel is quick to accept it and quickly, schedule the session, and just like if I invite Catherine and she accepts immediately, that's what she always does, then it goes very fast. If my other assessor wait at least a few weeks before they respond, then it is a bit slow. Okay, does that help? So that.
Oh, that's a good answer. So we'd probably say in the order of 2 to 3 months, I think, is a broad answer.
Yes, that's right.
Thanks, Fiona. Any differing views, Rob?
No, I've got no different views there. The only thing that could delay it as well is if you were asked to do some additional work to please the panel.
And Catherine, any differing views from yourself?
Just in addition to that, having been on the CPENG board for 6 years, there has been quite a significant backlog of applicants over time, and has been part of the problem has been with the backlog is getting enough Engineering New Zealand lead assessors and then practice lead assessors in certain disciplines, especially fields like structural and other fields like that, of actually having enough assessors to be able to form a team. So it's the forming of the team that's the slow part of the process, depending on resourcing. I know that they've addressed the Engineering New Zealand lead assessors, and that's improved the number of those and how many they can do. But there's still this problem in some disciplines of not having enough practice area assessors. So it could be 6 months, and for certain cases they are trying to reduce that now.
So I'm going to break my own rules and ask a random question. Are you seeing the number of people applying to get chartered increasing, or is it steady?
It's steady, but then you've also got the reassessments to consider as well. And as there's more CPENG certified engineers, we're getting more, the panel has had more and more recertifications every 6 years, or how many years you've been given your CPENG for, and so the pile keeps getting bigger. And that's what some of the problems are, is why you now need more practice area assessors and more lead assessors. And so Engineering New Zealand are looking at rationalising that about what reduced measures required for some engineers who are applying for recertification after a period of time that are deemed to be competent and acting professionally. So this is something that's being addressed at the moment.
Thanks for that. I'll get back to the proper running order. I guess that's the benefit of having a microphone in your hand. You can do what you want within reason. Next question. What are some of the reasons why you've declined a charter submission? Because I think this is a good one. There could be some lesson clarity. So I'll ask that of Fiona to start with.
Usually it's the complexity of the project submitted. When the project does not meet the complexity requirements according to the CPENG rules. If you all Google the CPENG rules 2002, you'll see that in Rule 7, there's a list of complexities, and these need to be met. And I find a lot of applicants, they are not able to articulate why their projects are complex, or that their projects are not sufficiently complex enough when they put in their submission. So it's very important that your projects are complex, sufficiently complex to do that, and that you are doing activities that are complex, and that the problems you are resolving are complex. So the definition is there. If you go to the rules, I'm going to put the link onto the bar, and I'll just ask Holly, are you able to put out that link? I put the link.
I think we'll be able to put that on later.
Yep.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so that's one of the main reasons why you don't, they don't get chartered, that we have declined chartered on those grounds. And there are a list of 12 elements. Just now, I think Rob talked about the elements. So remember, even though there are 4 groups, the 4 groups still cover the 12 elements, and you need to meet all of the elements before the panel will sign off on Chartership. Okay, thank you.
Oh, thanks, Fiona. Well, hang on, apparently there's a good follow-up question. Robert, sorry. Is it the complexity of the project or the complexity of the individual's role, or both? I guess that's targeted at you, Fiona, but all are welcome.
It's both. Sometimes it's the project, and sometimes it's the role of the applicant. They might be just collecting data for that project, for a complex project, and they are not involved in complex activities or complex problems. If you see, there's the link that Holly has put up there. If you go to Rule 7, you'll see the definition of the rules. If you all Google that, I'm looking at my screen, you'll see the definition for Rule 6 says the minimum standards for registration as a chartered professional engineer, and Rule 7 defines the complex engineering activities and problems. So you need to be able to ensure that the work that you are doing meets those requirements. Okay, if you Google that.
Oh, hopefully that answers your question, Rob. Obviously, if you want anything elaborated, you can ask another question. That's cool. Rob, have you got any views on why some people declined chartership?
I suppose some of the reasons that I look at people, how they come across in the interview. If they start to hesitate when you ask them questions, that starts to raise a few questions in my mind. And also look at the complex engineering, and everybody seems to have their own definition of complex engineering. And it all depends on how they come across.
Yeah, there seems to be a theme there with the complex engineering part. Cool. Catherine?
I would add that complex is a big one about being able to demonstrate complex work. It has to be what the candidate has actually done. The job itself will be complex, but if the activities, as Fiona said, that the candidate has worked on are not complex. Then
Oh, do you want to move your microphone a bit close to your mouth, Catherine? Sorry.
It must be moving, sorry. It's a very flexible microphone. It's the definition of complexity. The candidate must be their own work. They have got to have worked on the complex aspects of a large job, and if they've only been working on the clearly defined parts of it, then they haven't been doing complex activities. And sometimes, too, the activities that their company does, it's a small company, they don't actually get really involved in complex activities, and that makes it extremely hard for a candidate to get chartership. The other reason for declining is if they apply too early and haven't just demonstrated it across all the competencies. I've seen some with have been able to meet the communication requirements and a few other aspects because they haven't had sufficient time when they've submitted to demonstrate competence in all of the 12 competencies. So it's submitting a little bit too early at times, and also generally a lack of complex activities. They're the two ones that really are the reasons why there is a decline.
Yeah, thanks. Well, again, it's the complexity of the projects which seems to be
totally
coming through.
agree with that.
Sorry, Rob, say again.
Yep.
Yes.
I agree with that one.
There are a few who were not prepared when they submit their application. For those ones, we ask them to come back in about 2 years' time. And during that time, they'll be much more prepared and more in a matured role to talk about the complexity of their projects, because you need to explain to the panel why your projects are complex and what you do are complex activities, and the problems they are resolving are complex. Okay, and I've done about 450 assessments, and out of those ones, not many fail, I must say. So I think that is quite good news. There's only maybe about 10 that has failed out of the 450 assessments that I've done. So that is a good sign, I think. If you are diligent and you really explain why your projects are complex, why just like the problems I'm involved in are complex because there is no obvious solution to the problems I'm doing. That's one of the reasons, if you see, and require originality in analysis, because then you give an example from your project on why it is complex. It's good to have a mentor in those situations that you can talk to, and a group of you can come together and discuss it, and I think you can help each other to get through those bumps. Okay.
Oh, thanks for that. And Greg, do you have any views on why people don't get declined chartered?
Yeah, well, it comes down to the selection of evidence. I mean, I haven't had anyone fail, but I've had them have to go away and provide a lot more evidence because what they've provided is overly simplistic and actually doesn't demonstrate that they did something complex and they owned the whole process and all of the decisions and all of the inputs to drive all of the outputs. So it's that poor selection of work samples. So I've had a few who have gone in and says, no, there's no way that these guys will pass. But they've interviewed really well, and when you've dug down into a really technical, very nerdy, small piece of a decision, and they know the whole story behind it, you go, why didn't you put that in your evidence? That's brilliant. Yeah. And the others that Rob was talking about, that they provide fantastic evidence, but when you ask them that same question about a little piece of the corner that they and ah, and you go, ooh, that depth of knowledge perhaps really isn't there. So I haven't had the second one, but I've definitely had a couple where they've gone and had to then provide the evidence of what they've stated in their verbal presentation, which actually is much better than the poor selection of evidence they put forward.
Yeah, so you had to kind of bring the answer out of them.
Yeah. Can
I? Exactly. Yeah. Some extract really well.
Yeah, can I add something else?
Sure.
There are some participants whom I've interviewed, and when you ask them questions, they say, I don't know. Don't ever say that to the panel, that I don't know anything. I don't know how I got this calculation. I don't know why I use that factor in my calculations. Don't ever say that. It gives a very bad impression. At least you can check and find out why you use certain things. I find a lot of people say, I don't know for certain things, like even safety in design, or why calculations are like that, or if we ask about a certain issue in the, in the project, and they say, I don't know, I've not thought about that. And somebody told me, I don't know what is the code of ethics. Don't say that. You are, examined against all the elements, and one of them, just like, is ethical conduct. And you come and tell us that, oh, I've never read the code of ethics. It's not so, not very good, the code of ethical conduct. And don't ever say, those are important things, and don't come unprepared. Some I find they tend to be quite sure of themselves, and they come and not very prepared, and they have not gone through their projects well. And when we ask those of them, or ask about some of the elements, they say, I don't know. Don't ever say, I don't know. I find a few candidates saying that to me quite a lot of times.
That's probably a good lesson for all elements of engineering. Somebody asks you why you've done something, you need a robust answer. Yeah, no, thanks for that. Yes, of course.
Yeah, Chris, can I just say one thing on there? I think from the assessor's point of view, I don't think we're out there to fail people. What we're trying to build a good body, and we're trying to keep a standard that's high in the engineering field. So,
well, I think the key thing is about you've got to be prepared. So when you're asked a question, you can validate that you have an answer, and you can validate the answer. I think that's probably the key takeaway. Question 5. What's your advice or top 2 or 3 tips for somebody considering getting chartered? Now, this question was originally what's your advice or top tip, but Catherine had me alter it to top 2 or 3 tips. So I'm guessing there must be a few things to put across. So I'll ask this question to Rob first. What are your advice or top tips for somebody considering getting chartered?
I think
that's been a strong theme. Yes.
Make sure that you know what complex engineering is about, and make sure that your application is built around that. And again, what Fiona said, don't come in there and be negative. You've got to be positive, and it's I did this and I did that, not we. Because as soon as I hear we,
so everybody go through their documents now, changing the word we to I guess. Good. Catherine, thoughts?
Have a mentor who's got the SE pens already, so that they can guide you through what is needed for each of the competencies, and that makes a huge difference. Also, with the work samples, discuss with your mentor what type of work. So your training records, the training records, that making sure that it is actually legitimate training, because it's quite good definitions, but some candidates could put in things that aren't really relevant, and what sort of detail needs to be put in. Just saying 40 years private reading, what did you read? What did you learn from it? Those are key things we're looking for. and be prepared for the meeting. Know what you've put in your work samples and know it backwards and forwards, as I say quite often, because you've got to go and prepare. It's like going to a client with a report that you've prepared, which will help the client feel like if you said, oh, I don't know why I came to a certain answer, when you've actually prepared the report. So it's important to be prepared. They're the three things I think are key. But having a mentor who's got their CPNs helps an awful lot to guide you with what you need.
Thanks, Catherine. Greg, thoughts? Top tips?
Yeah, I agree with Rob on that. It's about picking good work samples. Demonstrate how complex we say it all the time now, but it's not the most expensive. It's not the biggest. It's not the whatever. Some of the smaller jobs with the smallest budgets and the operational sites like schools, for example, they can be the most complex because they just tick every element of time, cost, money, quality, all of those things. And so it's getting your head around, oh, it's not that $25 million job. There was one we did for $5,000 that had everything in it. And you find the smaller jobs, I find them to be better work examples because there's so much more of the materials interlaced, and that's what makes it complex as opposed to doing, here's the lighting calculations I did out of AGI. You went, yawn. You can teach your dog to use AGI, you know. Yeah. So I think understand what complex is and just pick good work examples and don't get blown away by big and flashy and glossy and dollar figures.
Oh, that's quite good actually, because it does give a strong indication that you don't have to be working on huge projects for them to be complex. It is about the project being complex in its nature as opposed to the scale of the project. And Fiona, thoughts from yourself?
Yep, the same as what the panel has said and what Catherine has said, to be really prepared for your interactive, know your projects back to front, what you have submitted, and know them inside out, so that when we ask questions, you know even where to go in your submission, because you'll be showing your project, showing maybe a control drawing or a schematic drawing, and know what to talk about. You know, the complex, if we ask you, what is your role in the project, be prepared, you know, and you talk about it and about the complex problems and activities you are doing to make it, because you remember the panel has to sign off on if you look at Rule 6 and Rule 7, all the different criteria, their elements that we have to sign off on. And so you help us as well, as we talk to you. It shouldn't be a frightening conversation. It's a professional conversation. You know a lot about your project, so tell us why it is complex, the work you are doing, and then that would be no issue at all. We find a lot of engineers do a lot of complex stuff, deal with a lot of complex activities and problems, and sometimes it is difficult for them to articulate that. And in those circumstances, maybe it's good to have a mentor within your organization to help you, to draw out what is complex about what you yourself are doing, not the team. It must be like I think Rob or Greg has said, it must be what you did, not we did. Okay, so remember that. If you keep on saying we did this, we did that, then we will think, what have you actually done? When we compare that to your team. So remember that. So yeah, be prepared when you come to the session.
Yeah, well, I think that's been the strong theme. A, be prepared. Make sure you've got projects with suitable complexity and demonstrate that what your part in those complex projects has been. I think that's one of some of the strong themes that should come through. Let me just, I think next question to members. Now, I don't know if anybody in the room has a question, but I think we've got a few on the screen there. So if I just read these through, from Ronnie, what are the requirements to become Chartership member? I don't know if anybody wants to answer that.
Is that member or a CPENG? You still have to, if it is just for a member, so there are two different things. There's a CPENG and there's also a chartered member of Engineering New Zealand. So both you need to go through an assessment, and then for CPench you'll be evaluated at least once every 6 years, while for membership it's for life. So, and the most important thing for CPench is that you need to be a Washington Accord, have a Washington Accord qualification equivalent. Okay, so if you put in your application to the team, to ENZ, the membership team will look through your qualifications and tell you whether it's Washington Accord or not.
I think if you've got a Sydney Accord, I've got a Washington Accord. I think if you've got a Sydney Accord, is that where you have a supplemental interview?
Yep, that's with knowledge assessment. If
Knowledge assessment.
yes, maybe Holly, you can show the slide on knowledge assessment. If you don't have Washington Accord, you still can try for chartership by going through knowledge assessment. So if you move to the slide on, yeah, and if you can move to the next slide.
Oops,
yep. Yeah, so this shows the complexity of your work and the 4 different classes. You see is professional engineer, technologist, technician, and geologist, and the different complex problems or broadly defined problems for engineering geologists. So it's different requirements for different classes. For professional engineer, you need Washington Accord. That's a 4-year BE or equivalent. Sydney Accord, that was spoken just now, is a technologist level. So it's usually a 3-year BEng Tech and so forth. So if I move to the next one, if you don't have I'm going to the knowledge assessment. If you don't have Washington Accord, you can still try by going first through a knowledge assessment. And these are the assessment requirements for knowledge assessment in 4 different areas where it will measure your knowledge in that degree that you might have, your qualification that you might have, and see whether it meets CPench Washington Accord equivalent. So I hope that answers your question in short.
Yeah, I think that's been good, thanks. Snowbin, how shall the final Chartership interactive session be like? Is it based on the documents submitted or the overall knowledge in NZ industry? Anybody like to answer that one?
Well, I would consider it's on what you. Off you go. I was going to say I would consider it on what you've presented.
I'll give it a go.
The evidence, that's what the practice series
Catherine,
goes
carry
through.
on.
And usually when I'm the practice series assessor, I get the candidate to go through one of their samples, and if they're a wee bit hesitant, and I haven't had any yet that are hesitant in my interviews, I would get them to go through another work example that they've presented on that I've read and got a pretty good appreciation of what their role was and what their complex activities are that they've brought out. But we wouldn't, so it's not a test. It's not a test on your knowledge of engineering. It's to demonstrate the interview is for you to demonstrate your competence. It will might ask you a few things about ethical conduct and other such things if we felt some evidence was lacking. But it's on the evidence presented. I'll let others talk a bit more.
Thanks, Catherine. Hopefully that's. Sorry, go on, Rob.
Yeah, I think typically that's the scenario that one. There, I think typically that's the way it would go. We'd base the questions and everything around the documentation that they've provided. And you will ask.
I have the Snowbins in the process of applying, so good luck. Corin, ex or current colleague of mine, can the complexity be outside of standard technical engineering? For example, a complex contractual work package integrating with existing systems or a landlord/tenant building. Thoughts, people? Rob?
I'm an engineering snob. I think, if it if it's project management and contract management, you know, I get to review complex engineering stuff, so it wouldn't be my preferred work sample, put it that way. I would rather you did something very nerdy in your technical engineering field that a project manager, for example, couldn't do, because, you know, we are all project managers, but we're not project managers, if that makes sense. That's sort of my take on it. I'm an elitist. I think we're nerdy electrical engineers. I like that fact that that's what our organisation specialises in. I would probably pick a different word.
So it sounds like it very much needs to be a specific engineering example. Where are we up to? Is that Ash next? Ash.
I mean, I'm not sure if the other people feel the same way about that. That's my take on it, because, you know, there are organisations for contract managers and property people and project managers, and we're one for.
Yeah, I agree too. And one of the practice fields that you can apply for is project management. So if your area is project management and you're managing and juggling multidisciplinary engineering projects, and it's complex because of those interactions.
Just move your microphone back towards your mouth a bit, Catherine. Sorry.
This has got the flexibility's got a bit flexible. It keeps flopping. It's like you can do complex project management activities, but then you'd be applying for a project management practice field, not for an electrical engineering field, and that's the difference.
True. Now I've got a question in the room, I think.
Hi, this is Adi speaking. If one has a master's degree that's Washington Accord and a bachelor's degree which is non-Washington Accord, would still be needed to do a knowledge assessment?
That would depend on the assessment. If you put it through the membership team, and they will be able to go through it and then see whether it's Washington Accord equivalent. If your master's is Washington Accord equivalent, you don't need to. But if it is not, it depends. Just like if you do an MBA in management, then it is not, it's not equivalent. So it depends on what that degree is. So if you put in your submission, your application, then they would be able to look through it.
To answer that too, if you have more than one degree, only one has to be Washington Accord, not all of them. So if one of your 2 or 3 degrees, because I've seen some with several degrees, only one's got Washington Accord, and that is satisfactory for meeting that requirement.
Does that answer your question? Oh, cool. Anybody else got any questions in the room before I jump back on the screen? So where are we at? Ash. For those who you considered to submit too early, for those you considered to submit too early, did they generally have less than 5 years experience?
For the ones that submit too early, yes, most of them had less than 5 years experience. So there would be about 3 years to 4 years, and some tend to want to have it very fast. So I think those are the ones who submit too early, or if they didn't have sufficient New Zealand experience. So you need to have your New Zealand experience before you can apply for CPENG. But the chartered member for Engineering New Zealand does not, does not stop you from applying if you have not enough years practicing in New Zealand. If you know what I mean. For CPENG, you need the relevant years in New Zealand to be able to talk about New Zealand specific requirements, the regulations and the practices, the good practices in the industry that you are applying for. So you'll need the number of years in New Zealand. So sometimes if you have not enough years in New Zealand, you will not be aware of many of the requirements. So if we ask you some questions on New Zealand requirements, you may not be able to answer those. So that would be also constitutes an application that is too early because you have not enough experience in New Zealand for overseas applicants. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Fiona. Where are we at? Daniel. can you use an ongoing project as part of the evidence? I presume that means if you're in the middle of a particularly long 5-year design period or something, whether you could use that as an experience. Can you use an ongoing project as part of the evidence?
Yeah,
I'd concur on that.
personally
Most
don't
of the
think
ones I've
that
seen
that
have been
would hold you
shorter time
back.
durations projects, but as long as you have done complex activities
Some
and the
projects go on for
projects are
years.
completed, you can show your part of that project in a multi-interdiscipline project, or it's just a massive, great big project with one discipline. The latter is not very often. There's no reason that I would think those work samples aren't satisfactory, because as long as you demonstrate that complex activity in there.
Thanks, Catherine. Same. Project managers doing electrical NV substation for various types of users, switchgear projects, etc. fit in the criteria. Project managers doing electrical NV substations for various types of users, switchgear projects, etc. fit in the criteria. I wonder if that's pointing back at somebody doing a project management exercise in a technical field. Does anybody have a view on that?
It has to be complex activities. If he's just involved in coordinating activities on site, that is not complex activities. But it could be deemed to be in the project management area. There was a tendency to think about large multidiscipline engineering projects with sort of project management. But as a consideration, the biggest thing is the size of the projects to go for the project management. If it's just the supervision of gear going into a site, that wouldn't be deemed to be project management. It could be the role if it's building services in the area of contract contract supervision on site. So to get electrical, you've got to demonstrate complex activities in that field.
Yeah, again, I think that comes back to demonstrating the complexity. Travis, is there a benefit to using the online CPD record through the Engineering New Zealand website versus keeping a personal written record? Does it make the assessors work easier? I think it makes everybody's life easier using the online one, because you can copy and paste words from other ones. You can, I think it's just such an easy system that Engineering New Zealand has compared to other professional bodies. But does the panel have a view? Do you have an option? I thought you had to put it all online these days.
For me, I would prefer you to put that online, but you can also use an Excel file. That's what I do send out to some of my applicants who don't like to put in the record one by one. There's an Excel file, then you can record it per year, and then in the end, just like your total activities, 10 activities, you total 45 hours. Then you put the total number for that year, 45 hours, onto the site together with the Excel file, identifying the details of your activities, what you have learned, the days, the hours, all day. So you can also use an Excel file, no problems at all. But you must put in the details on what you have learned in that file. Does that help?
It's a really good to get into, especially when you're doing your own personal regular assessments, and if you get into the habit of entering it effectively the day or week that you get it, you don't ever have to worry about your own assessment, because it just accumulates. So why not start that at the start of your process?
So I think what we're saying is you can use other methods, but it's probably easiest to do little and often using the Engineering New Zealand system, which I think is a very, very easy to use system.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if you use it quicker.
Pranav, 1. Please guide me for registered as CPEng and assess my degree to meet Washington Accord. Sorry, we'll go to Tom. Tom, are you able to give insights into levels expected of Chartered Member, Engineering Technician, Dublin Accord? Does that come under the scope of this seminar? Cheers, Tom. I'm not too sure what the scope of this seminar is, but it's a broad one at that, so I don't know if anybody's got an answer to that.
if you saw this slide just now, so for engineering technician that you're talking about, so it's the same requirements. You still submit the requirements using the portal and write up your projects, but your projects is just is using well-defined engineering problems and activities. It's not complex. Can you see the slide here?
Yep.
So the details would be on the portal, and if you call in and ask one of the advisors, they would be able to help you. Is that okay? If you call Engineering
Yeah,
New Zealand,
answers.
yep, they should
Cool,
be
thanks for
able
that.
to help you on that for technician status.
Hope you answer that. What's our next question? Daniel, what is the practice area assessment for a hydro asset maintenance automation stroke electrical engineer? What is the practice area assessment for a hydro asset maintenance automation stroke electrical engineer? That sounds a pretty cool job. You should come and do as a presentation on what one does. Anybody want to answer that?
Catherine, you're mute.
Please. Am I on mute? Oh, sorry, Catherine.
Sorry.
Have you
I
put
didn't
yourself
have
on?
a screensaver turned on, and that's when it turned me off. I didn't know I'd done it, you see, so I had a key, that didn't turn it back on again. Yeah, no, what I was saying is I'd have to have a look at the work samples. That's a pretty
Yeah.
Just want to move the microphone close to your mouth, Catherine. Sorry.
slipping. They don't know why it's got flexible. I think it's just getting pretty worn now. I've had it for quite a few years. Yes,
You need to put an elastic band around your head.
I'll skip that. I think a new headset would be a good idea. Yes, you'd have to see the work samples because I'd have to have a look at and think about what it is in order to give it a nice, concise pad. It sounds pretty wordy, but it's not something you can sort of impromptu just say, this is the pad I would put in. It's definitely involved in hydro projects, which would be generation and automation. So those two are key components of that PAD.
Yes.
So it certainly sounds promising.
Yep.
Sounds very promising. Sounds very technical. I'll be very interested to see some work samples.
Yep.
Yeah, we'd like to see a presentation. Well, I would anyway. Hoping that answers the question. What are we on next? Anand. Is overseas experience considered to meet the experience requirement for CPEng? If yes, is different engineering sector like software engineering considered? Thoughts, anybody?
It depends on the practice field. Like for power engineers, they could easily meet a lot of the requirements working in overseas jurisdictions because it's common throughout the world. It's the area of New Zealand's safety sectors and ethical code which you'd have to be knowledgeable about, and that's why it does help you some New Zealand experience as well. For structural engineers, unless they've got experience in New Zealand, I haven't really seen anybody get this. They can't really get the CPEng from scratch without being in New Zealand because of the unique requirements of structural engineers in New Zealand. So it definitely is determined on which practice field you're working in.
Well, thanks for that. Robert, do you struggle to find assessors who are experts in the field that the candidate is competent in? Nice broad question.
Usually there would be assessors, but sometimes in some areas we do struggle. But